Okay, as we begin our class tonight, I want us to review just real quickly. Last week we looked at the profile of a desperate wife, and then this evening we're going to look at the other side of the marriage of the husband. Basically, we saw that the desperate wife, she gets married expecting happiness, and then natural problems arise. She blames herself and looks for solutions, takes classes. She sees the other husbands in the classes responding, but hers isn't. Her problems are continuing. This causes depression, and she blames herself even more, only illogically now, thinking, if only I were prettier, if only I were this, if only I were that. And then depression sets in because she's blaming herself illogically. Her self-image starts to deteriorate, and then she starts to fight for emotional survival, just to fight for survival as a person. She finally turns to start blaming her husband. When she starts to blame him, then he reacts with anger, and this doesn't solve her problem. When she confronts her husband, then he reacts with anger, and that doesn't solve the problem, so her depression deepens. And then many times she begins to blame God because this is safe, God's in heaven. He can't shout at her, he can't hit at her, he can't mistreat her in the ways that her husband does, so she begins to blame God. And once she reaches this stage, then she's in danger of leaving her husband and going to leave the church because she doesn't want her brethren trying to force her back into a relationship that she knows that she cannot survive as a person. So what we want to do tonight is we want to look at, while all of this is going on with the desperate wife, while she's going through this process of fighting for emotional survival, we want to look at what's happening with her husband. As I told you last week, that in a desperate marriage, there's always some type of sin involved in that marriage. And what I want us to do, you have your handouts there and you can take notes on the handout, is we're going to look at some common types of sin that are involved in marriage. And then after we look at these common types of sin and have them in our minds, then we're going to apply them to the husband and see what it is that he is doing while the woman is fighting for survival. The first sin I have up here is the sin of bitterness. And in Hebrews 12, verse 15, let's turn over there right quick and look at this passage. This is where it's talking about Esau, how he was a bitter individual, and talking about the effect of bitterness on our minds. In Hebrews 12, verse 15, and here it says, "See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by it many be defiled. And there be no immoral or godless person like Esau, who sold his own birthright for a single meal." So notice it says that bitterness is a root. And first of all, I want to notice that bitterness means bitter gall, extreme wickedness, a bitter root, and so producing bitter fruit, bitter hatred, and it's a bitter speech. But then it says that bitterness is a root, and we all know what a root is. A root is underneath a plant. It's what supports that plant, and it's what the plant grows out of. And what the Hebrew writer is going to do here, he's going to use the metaphor of a plant, describing bitterness as something that grows like a plant. He says this bitterness springs forth. It's springing forth. Springing means to beget, bring forth, produce, to be born, to spring up, to grow. Here's our idea of a plant. To shoot forth, to spring up. And so it's something that once bitterness comes into your heart, it grows and it springs up just like a plant coming up. And as bitterness is growing, bitterness always causes trouble. Causes trouble means to excite disturbance, to trouble, to annoy. The growth of a poisonous plant, again we have our idea of a plant growing, a large poisonous plant growing. Figuratively, it's representing the man who corrupts the faith, piety, and then a hater of the Christian church. So here is this root of bitterness that it's growing and it's getting bigger and bigger, just like a poisonous plant. And then as it grows, then we see down here, by it many are defiled. This word defiled means to dye with another color, to stain, to defile, pollute, sully, contaminate with soil, defile with sin. What bitterness does is just like we took ourselves and we dipped ourselves into a vat of dye. We changed the color. Bitterness always changes the person who allows it to come into their heart. And bitterness, I've listed bitterness first, is because all the sins we're going to look at, nearly every one of them has an aspect of bitterness. And when you start to deal with these sins, you're going to have to go back and deal with the bitterness that is in that person's life. So bitterness is something that's like a big poisonous plant that gets a hold and it starts growing just like a plant does. But bitterness is also what I would call a cluster sin. And by that I mean that there are other sins that like to grow around bitterness and and feed off of bitterness. Let's turn over to Ephesians 4, verse 31, and notice how it is that bitterness leads to other sins. In Ephesians 4, verse 31, here it is, he says, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. So notice here that he starts off with bitterness, and then he names wrath and anger and clamor and slander and all these other sins. So bitterness goes along with other sins. Notice the word wrath. Wrath means both the spirit, panting as it were in the body, and the rage with which the man pants and swells. So it's really kind of a colorful word, I think, there for wrath. Passion, angry heat, anger forthwith boiling up and soon subsiding again. So this is anger that gets hot real fast and just boils out, a hot-headed type person. Anger, on the other hand, denotes indignation, which has arisen gradually and become more settled. So this type of anger is just a slower, perhaps if there is such a thing, a more calm type of anger. Then clamor, some of the translations, I was trying to remember the word for clamor. Here, screaming is what I saw in another one of the translations. Clamor means crying, outcry, clamor. So in other words, screaming or a shouting contest. Slander means railing, reviling. Universally, it means to slander, detraction, tearing someone down. Speech, injurious to another's good name. Specifically, impious and reproachful speech, injurious to the divine majesty. Now, I know you've heard in other classes that slander is the way the Bible translates the Greek word that our word blaspheme comes from. When this word is applied to God, it's translated blaspheme, and when it's applied to man, it is translated slander. So slander comes from a bitter heart. And then malice means malignity, malice, ill will, desire to injure. So all of these horrible sins are sins that have their beginning in bitterness, and bitterness is something that causes these sins to be more serious. Now, as we continue to look at bitterness, in Colossians 3:19, this is the passage where God tells the husband to love his wife and to not be embittered against her. So God gives the husband a special responsibility to not be embittered against his wife. Embitter simply means to embitter, exasperate, to render angry, indignant, or irritated. So a man has a responsibility to control his anger, to control his bitterness, and to live with his wife in a loving way. So bitterness is the first sin we want to look at. The second sin we want to look at is that of judging motives. And let's turn over to 1 Corinthians 2, verse 11, to notice about judging motives. Here it is, he's talking about God and how it is that God is different from us. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 11. And he says, "For who among men knows the thoughts of a man except the spirit of the man which is in him? Even so, the thoughts of God no one knows except the Spirit of God." So we don't know God's thoughts, and not only that, we don't know each other's thoughts. If we don't ask someone what their motive is, why they've done something, we don't know. As human beings, we don't have that ability to judge motives. Judging motives is like bitterness. In nearly every one of the sins we're going to look at later, you find judging motives. Bitterness and judging motives are sins that seem to go together, and they magnify all other sins. They lead to other sins. And judging motives is something that is very, very detrimental to a marriage. I have up here a newspaper clipping. And this clipping is about Dr. Aaron T. Becks and his work that he has done for many, many years in working with couples and trying to help prevent divorce. And it says, Dr. Beck's idea was simple. Change the way people think, and you can change their lives. Challenge a few unrealistic beliefs, alter some habitual thought patterns, and people will stop being depressed. They will lose their anxieties, kick their drug habits, and give up alcohol. So he's saying all these problems start with the thoughts, what the thoughts are thinking about. And he says the number one problem with negative thinking and the number one problem in marriage is judging motives. So here's a man who's not a Christian. He's not caring about Christian principles especially, but yet he sees the damage that judging motives does to a marriage. So these are very serious sins. These are sins that nearly all couples do unless they have learned not to do them. Okay, then the next sin we want to notice is that of emotional abuse. In 1 Corinthians 5:11, this is the passage where you remember that Paul told them to disfellowship the man who had taken his father's wife. And then he lists a group of sins for which we are to disfellowship individuals. And among those group of sins is that of a reviler. Also in 1 Corinthians 6:10 is a list of sins that people have these sins. They're not going to inherit the kingdom of heaven. And among this list is the word reviler. And so a reviler is something that we want to look at because it is essentially emotional abuse. And of course, these sins are sins that are going to primarily take place in the home, the sin of reviling. All the questionnaires that people have been filling out and giving back to me, not only in this class, but also the ones that have come back to me from across the country. One of the questions I ask on there is, does your husband control his temper around his family, around your family, around his boss, around the neighbors, around the police, and all of these other people? And I have not yet gotten a questionnaire back where the person checked, no, he doesn't control his temper around all of these places. The only place where he chooses not to control his temper is with his wife. So this sin of being a reviler is a sin that is committed primarily in the home. Now this passage in Proverbs 24, or Proverbs 25, verse 24, let's turn over there right quick and look at that. In Proverbs 25, verse 24. And what we want you to notice is that women can also commit this same sin. This is not a sin that is limited to men. In Proverbs 25, verse 24, it says, "It is better to live in a corner of the roof than in a house shared with a contentious woman." This word contentious is translated in the Septuagint. The Septuagint, you remember, is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. This is translated with our same word, reviler. So it's better to live in the corner of a house than to have a whole house with a woman who is a reviler. So this is a sin that women commit just as well as men commit it. Okay, reviler means railer, reviler. And because this is such a common and such a serious sin, what I did was I went to Webster and I looked up all the synonyms that mean the same thing as reviler. And I want us to look at the synonyms that are the same as reviler. It means to scold, implies rebuking in irritation or ill temper justly or unjustly. So reviling doesn't have anything to do with whether the person deserve to be chewed out or not. It has to do with the way the person chewed them out. Upbraid implies censuring on definite and usually justifiable grounds. So here it is again. You're upbraiding somebody on something that is usually a justifiable ground. Something that, yes, they really did do it wrong, but again, it is the way they are being taught to rather than what they're being criticized for. Berate suggests prolonged and often abusive scolding. So it may be something that goes on for a long period of time. Excuse me. Rail, at or against, stresses an unrestrained berating. So the idea of railing is that they're unrestrained, they're out of control to a certain degree in their railing. Revile implies a I can't pronounce that word. I looked it up in the dictionary, still can't pronounce it. Abusive attack prompted by anger or hatred. So it's an abusive attack prompted by anger or hatred. And this other word, Shirley, do you know how to pronounce that? Does anybody know how to pronounce that? Anyway, it looks bad, doesn't it? So, anyway, it suggests a violent reviling. So whatever this word is, it's bad because it suggests a violent railing. Reviling. So here, this is emotional abuse, where someone may be criticizing someone for something that they deserve to be criticized for, but yet they are being taught to in a way that is degrading, with anger, lack of self-control, and being treated in a very abusive way. Now, emotional abuse often leads to physical abuse. As far as I know, there is always emotional abuse involved in physical abuse, and a person may go on for a long period of time involved in emotional abuse and over a period of years before they get into physical abuse. So reviling is something that leads to physical abuse. And I spent quite a bit of time looking for passages that deal with physical abuse. And I want you to notice some of these words here that we're going to be dealing with. Let's look over at first at Titus 3, verses 1 through 2. so that we can have these passages and these words in our mind. In Titus 3, verses 1 through 2. Okay, here it says, remind them to be subject to rulers, to authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good deed, to malign no one, to be uncontentious, gentle, showing every consideration for all men. For we also were once foolish ourselves, disobedient, deceived, enslaved to various lusts and pleasures, spending our life in malice and envy, hating one another. So here's a group of sins that have to do with anger and with bad attitudes toward each other, other people. And there's this word, uncontentious. And this word means commonly not to be withstood, invincible, more rarely abstaining from fighting. So the people are to learn to abstain from fighting. And if they are being contentious, the opposite of this would be that they would be involved in fighting. This word is used only twice in the New Testament. The other place is in 1 Timothy 3:3 for the qualifications of elders, and then here in Titus 3:2 that elders are not to be fighting individuals. Then, all of these verses that I have here, we're not going to look each one of these up. But in Romans 1:29, and in 1 Corinthians 5:8, and Ephesians 4:31, Colossians 3:8, Titus 3:3, James 1:21, and 1 Peter 2, verse 1, and verse 16, all of these verses are very similar, and they all have one word that I want us to especially notice, and to notice that this word, the effect that this word is going to have with physical abuse. And let's look up, the one passage I want us to look up is Romans 1, verse 29, verse 30. And we'll use this for our typical passage for the way the rest of these are. And then you can look the rest of these up at home. In Romans 1, verses 29 through 30, here it is. It's talking about, let's begin in verse 28. And it says, just as they, talking about the Gentiles, did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind, to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, and so on it goes. I want us to notice two words in that list, and if you go look at the other passages, you're going to see these two similar words in them also. Notice up here that wickedness means depravity, iniquity, wickedness, malice, evil purposes, and desires. Then when we look at malice, malice means malignity, malice, ill will, desire to injure. So I want you to notice that malice is an attitude, a desire to injure. It is wickedness, it is depravity. And then it says wickedness that is not ashamed to break the laws. So it's not affected by what the civil government says or what religious laws are. It's not afraid to break the laws. Evil, trouble. Now, down here I have the basic difference between malice and wickedness. Notice that malice denotes the vicious disposition. It is the attitude of a desire to injure, whereas wickedness is the active exercise of the same. So you understand what I'm saying? When a person practices malice, they have a desire to injure. When the Bible condemns wickedness, it is condemning the active exercise of the same. The wicked individual not only has the desire to injure, but he goes ahead and he practices it. He does it. He abuses other people physically. Then the second form of malice in this group is a form of the first, but it means bad character, depravity of heart and life, specifically used of malignant subtlety, malicious craftiness. And so these are serious sins, and they are this sin of physical abuse is something that the Bible deals with. Now, this last passage I have up here, 1 Peter 3:7. This is where God commands the husband. Let's just turn over there and look at that so we can get all the parts of this straight. In 1 Peter 3, verse 7, of course, this is a passage that we're all familiar with. It says, you husbands likewise live with your wives in an understanding way, as with a weaker vessel, since she is a woman, and grant her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. So here it is. It says that men are to live with their wives in an understanding way, since she is a weaker vessel and since she is a woman. A man is not to be using his brute force against his wife. He is to be recognizing her as a weaker vessel. He is to be treating her with respect and honor since she is a woman. I went to the shelter again this last week in Tacoma and learned a few things while I was there. Went to their initiation program, I guess, to wife abuse. And they said that there is an expert in downtown Seattle who has been counseling men in anger control sessions for 20 years. And they said he is one of the best men in the country dealing with men in teaching these anger control classes. And he says that he is convinced that all men, that men, when they abuse their wives physically, many times these men will say, I didn't know what I was doing. I couldn't help myself. And this expert is convinced that all men know what they're doing. He is convinced that every man, before he hits his wife, he knows that he's going to hit her, and he also knows where he's going to hit her. He knows exactly what he's doing, and so he's convinced that these men do know exactly what they're doing. I also learned that 50% of the women that go to the emergency rooms are there because of wife abuse. So this is something that is a serious problem. I also read that in 50% of the marriages that every husband will hit his wife at least once during the course of their marriage. So this is something that is a serious sin, and it is a serious problem that we need to learn how to deal with. However, even though men are the ones that are more likely to do this, men are not the only ones who are involved in physical abuse. I have one of Ann Lander's columns here, and I have a letter that someone wrote her. He says, Dear Ann, I live in Utah, where physically abusing a woman is looked upon as a very serious charge. I want you to know what I've put up with for 3 years. I'm now in the process of being divorced. He says, when my wife doesn't get her way, she becomes violent. I'm 6 feet 5 inches tall, so he's 6'5", and he says Mary is 5'4", so he's a little over a foot taller than she is. He says, she has put me in the hospital twice. We've been married 3 years. In all that time, I slapped her only once when she threw her $1,500 engagement ring out the window. I never did find it. Since that time, I haven't laid a hand on her. But she has kicked me, torn my clothes, pulled my hair out, and scratched my face and arms. The reason I let her beat on me is because in Utah, you don't hit a woman. I had to appear in court when she charged me with aggravated assault. My wife didn't have a bruise on her body. It was a humiliating experience. Everyone knew about it, family, friends, and my employer. A lot has been written about wife beating, but very little about husbands who get beaten up by their wives. Husband beating is one of the best kept secrets of our time. Please speak out, Ann. And then Ann says, husband beating is no secret to me or to anyone else who reads this column. She says, I've dealt with it many times. My advice to men who get clobbered by the spouse is the same as for women whose husbands beat them up. Insist that the offender get counseling or get out pronto. Okay, I have another letter here to her sister, Dear Abby. And he says, Dear Abby, I'm getting tired of reading all the letters about battered women. Yes, I know it must be a terrible experience for a woman, but nobody ever mentions the battered man. It's even worse for them because they are so embarrassed and ashamed, they never tell anybody. I know. I was raised never to hit a woman, even in self-defense. Many times my ex-wife would throw things at me and come at me with her fingernails, drawing blood from the scratches she would inflict on my face and neck. She even broke my arm and ribs when she threw a heavy chair at me. I always made up some kind of lie when I had to go to the emergency room of the hospital after she beat me up. I stayed in this terrible marriage as long as I could for the sake of our child. When I finally couldn't take it any longer, I divorced her. She fought the divorce, but I was firm and made the break. She retaliated by filing charges against me, stating that I had sexually abused our child. I had to endure some humiliating questioning, and it cost me nearly $10,000 in legal fees to prove my innocence. It's a long and very ugly story, but my ex-wife was finally found to be clinically psychotic and paranoid with multiple personality disorders. Meanwhile, the accusations were devastating. I'll be surprised if you print this because you usually favor women, but every word I have written is true. Dear Abby says, surprise, your case is not unusual, and from the mail I receive, I can attest to that. Thanks for writing. So this is something that's not limited just to men, but there are occasions of where women are involved in this. I guess the first case that I ever came of physical abuse was that of a Christian woman who abused her husband. She would go after him chased him down the stairs one time with a hot skillet full of grease. She'd throw glasses at him, and she would scream, go outside and scream so loud in front of the neighbors that he would do whatever she wanted so that she'd quit embarrassing him. She had no qualms about screaming in stores. And of course, he would give her whatever she wanted, just like a little child throwing a temper tantrum in a store. This was what she was like, and she got her way because he was so embarrassed with the way people act. So wife abuse, or women abusing their husbands, husband abuse, is something that we do see, although it is not as common as wife abuse is. In your handout that I gave you, the handout is from the shelter in Santa Maria, California. And if you look just inside the front page, then you'll see a chart of the different types of abuse that men do to women. So the wife abuse really is something that is a more serious sin that we do find in the home, and there are all sorts of things that men do to their wives. Now, while you're still looking at that chart, we're going to talk about another kind of sin, and that is sexual abuse. And when I'm talking about sexual abuse, I'm not talking about sexual neglect. I'm not talking about a spouse who just doesn't have as many or as strong sexual desires as the other one. I'm talking about sexual abuse. And on that same little chart that you're looking at at the end, it has down one column is sexual abuse. And when you hear the things that go on in sexual abuse, it is just something that is so horrible. It's things that you don't want in your mind. And that little chart that I've given you is a watered-down version of what actually goes on when you read some of these women's stories and they tell of what has happened in their marriages. It is something that is done not to give pleasure, but it is something that is done very cruel. It's not uncommon for these men to make their wives look at pornographic material. It's not uncommon for them to make them have sexual relationships with other men while they watch, or with women while they watch. They use objects on their wives in a way that is designed to cause pain and to humiliate and to degrade them. So this is what we're talking about. We're talking about sexual abuse, not sexual neglect. In 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 3 through 6, this is where God tells us that we are to not engage in the lustful passion of the Gentiles, but we are to know how to possess our own sexual vessel in sanctification and honor. God wants us to know how to use the sexual relationship right. And then, in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 2 through 4, or let's see. Okay, in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 2 through 4, this is a passage that we've looked at many times before, where that the wife does not have power over her body, but the husband does, and that they are to render their duty, fulfill their duty to each other. The word fulfill means to put away by giving, give up, give over, deliver, relinquish what is one's own, hence to sell, pay off, discharge what is due, because a debt, like a burden, is thrown off by being paid, a debt. To give back, restore, respite, recompense. So fulfill is talking about paying a debt. When you fulfill your mate's sexual needs, then you are fulfilling a debt. And with the word duty, and of course this is exactly what the word duty means, that which is owed, a debt, conjugal duty. So in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 2 through 4, this is where God commands Christians to fulfill their sexual duty to their partner to satisfy their partner's needs. Sexual abuse does not do that. Sexual abuse does not fulfill the partner's sexual desires and sexual needs. It violates them and causes mental and physical pain. So sexual abuse is something that in these marriages where where the marriage has gone on from emotional abuse and then it has gone to physical abuse, then sexual abuse is something that is very common in these marriages. Then there is another type of abuse that I want us to talk about, and that is spiritual abuse. And spiritual abuse is a term that you're going to start seeing more and more in literature. This is a term that psychologists are now using. Psychologists are now recognizing that there is such a thing as spiritual abuse. And I want us to turn over to 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 21 through 22, and get our passages for this sin. And what spiritual abuse is, basically, is where the mate, whether it is the husband or the woman, usually it is the husband, where he does not give his wife the right to make spiritual decisions for herself. In 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 21 through 22, here it is, God says, but examine everything carefully. Some of your translations may say, but prove everything. Hold fast to that which is good. Abstain from every form of evil. Every individual has a responsibility to search out and to discover the truth in regard to their life with God. A husband cannot determine what the truth is and tell his wife and tell her, this is what the truth is, this is where I want you to go to church, this is what I want you to believe, this is what I want you to do. God does not give the man that right. God holds the woman responsible for studying and determining things for herself. She can't give that right to her husband. And spiritual abuse is where the husband takes that right away from her. He forces certain spiritual activities upon her which are not pleasing to her. Let's turn over to Hebrews 10 and see one of the most common areas of where spiritual abuse occurs. This is something that is very common in the church, especially with women who are married to men who are not Christians. In Hebrews 10, verses 22 through 26, here it is, it says, let us draw near with a sincere heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our body washed with pure water. So here it is, our attitude is something that is very important. Then verse 23, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. So we're to hold fast our beliefs and the things that we're doing to please God. We're to do it without wavering. And then in verse 24, and the part of the way that we hold fast and not waver, it says, let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good works, not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. For if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. And if you remember the setting of the book of Hebrews, Hebrews was written to Christians who were undergoing a persecution. They might lose their life if they attended worship services. And yet the Hebrew writer tells them not to forsake this assembling, that they need the build-up and the encouragement of other Christians. And women, especially women whose husbands are not Christians, and they need this too. This is something God has given them. And a husband does not have the right, whether he's a Christian or not a Christian, to tell his wife that she cannot attend Sunday evening or Wednesday evening services. Sometimes husbands give their wives the right to attend only Sunday morning, but you can't go any other time. You need to stay home with me where you belong, in their way of thinking. God's law overrides the husband's law in this regard. And it is the woman's right to attend services, to associate with other Christians, and to be with them. And so this is something that we see a lot in the church, but this is something that psychologists are now starting to recognize, where the man takes away the woman's right to decide things for herself. Then I have down child abuse is a sin that goes on in the homes sometimes and causes problems. In Galatians 5:19, let's go ahead and look at that, because I'm going to be referring to this from time to time. In Galatians 5:19 through 21 is talks about the fruit of the flesh. In verse 19 it says, now the deeds of the flesh are evident, which are immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmities, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, disputes, dissensions, factions, envyings, drunkenness, carousings, and things like these, of which I forewarn you, just as I have forewarned you, that those who practice such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. So in this list, he's got immorality, impurity, sensuality. And all of these would include child abuse. So child abuse is a sin that does cause damage to the marriage. Then I have down adultery, homosexuality. And let's look at 1 Corinthians 6:9, because we'll be referring to this several times also. 1 Corinthians 6:9 is just simply a list of the unrighteous who are not going to inherit the kingdom of God. Okay, and here it says in verse 9, or do you not know that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God?
Do not be deceived, neither fornicators, nor adulterers, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor homosexuals, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers shall inherit the kingdom of God. So in this list is adulterers and several different forms of homosexuality. And of course, there are women who discover in marriage that their husbands are homosexuals, and it is something that causes a woman to be a desperate wife and causes marriage problems. Okay, as we're continuing to look at the sins that cause a woman to be a desperate wife, to notice another one here, and that is the ones of drunkenness and drug abuse. And I have combined drunkenness and drug abuse because as the definitions will show you, there is a connection between them. We've already read in 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 through 10, we've read about that drunkenness is a sin that's going to keep people from inheriting the kingdom of God. Drunkenness simply means drunken or intoxicated. The word intoxicate comes from the Greek word toxum, which means poison. So drunkenness means he's drunken or he has poisoned himself. Intoxicate means to excite or stupefy by alcohol or a drug, especially to the point where physical and mental control is markedly diminished. And then here's the other extreme. So not only are you stupefied by it, or you can go the other side, to excite or elate to the point of enthusiasm or frenzy. So here's the low, and here's having some kind of a high because you're intoxicated. Then to specifically apply this to drug abuse, in Galatians 5:20 that we just read in the works of the flesh, is the word sorcery. The word sorcery means the use or the administering of drugs. Here's our word poisoning again. Drugs are poisoning just like alcohol is a poisoning thing. Sorcery, magical arts, and so drugs, all types of hallucinating drugs and drugs having effects on people were used in the practice of sorcery, and so drug use is included in the works of the flesh. So this is another sin that causes problems in marriage. Okay, as we continue to notice another sin here, and that is the sin of sexual neglect. Now this is different from sexual abuse. There's not any pain or any kind of depravity going along with it, but it's just simply neglecting the legitimate needs of the mate. In 1 Corinthians 7, verses 2 through 5, we've already talked about that, where the man doesn't have power over his own body, but the woman does. We've talked about that in Song of Solomon, that basically that means that a man does not have within his body what it takes to satisfy him. It takes a woman to satisfy a man's sexual desires. Likewise, the woman does not have authority over her own body. A woman doesn't have within herself what it takes to satisfy her sexual desires. It takes a husband to satisfy her sexual desires, a man. And so then in 1 Corinthians 7, let's go ahead and look over there and get the second part of this verse, or this section here. Down in verse 5 it says, "Stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come back together again, lest Satan tempt you because of your lack of self-control." So he says, stop depriving each other. The word deprive means to defraud, to rob, to despoil, to deprive one of a thing, defraud of a thing, withdraw or keep back a thing by fraud. So deprive really is kind of an ugly word to involving taking advantage of another person, robbing them of something that belongs to them. As we saw earlier, the word duty. The man has a duty to his wife. The wife has a duty to her husband. Something is owed to the wife and something is owed to the husband. So when they withhold their sexual favors, they are robbing them of something that they owe them legitimately. Then he says that you're only to do it for a time. And this word time has within it that it means, within the word itself, it means a measure of time, a fixed and definite time. You don't keep back from the other one to say, well, I've had enough of this and this, I don't care to have any more sexual relationships from now on. No, you don't do that. Because of something in your life that perhaps a time of stress or anxiety when this does not seem appropriate, then you, for a limited period of time, a fixed and definite time, then you withhold having relations with each other.
And the reason you do this is so that Satan will not tempt you. Tempt means to try whether a thing can be done. Attempt, endeavor, try, make trial of, or test. And then Satan is going to tempt you because of your lack of self-control, which means want of self-control, incontinence, intemperance. Now basically this section right here where it says so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control is a very important concept. You know, many times when you'll read a book on the sexual relationship, you'll have a section in there about how often couples of different ages make love. Do they do it 3 times a week or 3 times a month or whatever? And you can look at this chart and you can see if you're normal. However, one thing these charts do not tell you is they don't tell you if happily married couples make love 3 times a week or if unhappily married couples make love 3 times a week. So do happily married couples do it more, or do happily married couples do it less? What I'm saying is these little charts don't mean a thing. Yet God has told us how frequent is enough. And how frequent is enough is this expression, lest Satan tempt you because of your lack of self-control. How frequent it should be frequent enough that the mate is not tempted. The mate does not wake up or doesn't have sensuous dreams visualizing someone else because they feel like that their mate is not available. So however often it takes so that mate does not have to fight temptation, doesn't have to fight temptation at work, doesn't have to fight temptation just going to the mall or whatever. So however long it takes so that the mate is no longer tempted, then that is what is owed the mate. That is the duty to have it often enough, make love often enough so that the mate does not have to fight temptation. So this is something that is very personal, something that is different with each couple, and something that they're going to have to work out and to talk about. But the control factor is where temptation starts. If one of them is fighting temptation, then they need to be having relations more often. I have down here 4 common reasons why married couples engage in sexual neglect. It may be because of Victorian morals, looking down on a sexual relationship, having a negative attitude towards it. Men have as many Victorian morals as women do. Men many times have very negative attitudes towards a sexual relationship because of the way they were raised and things that they have heard. Past sexual abuse also causes people to have negative attitudes towards a sexual relationship and to not satisfy their mate. Within the last month or 2, there was a full-page article in the Seattle Times about men who had been sexually abused. Men are not sexually abused perhaps as much as women are, but they are sexually abused. And there is some kind of a counseling group here in Seattle for men who have been sexually abused. And the author of this article is saying that these men have a lot of hang-ups because of their abuse. They have a very negative attitude towards this relationship. They have trouble functioning with a wife because of the sexual abuse they've had in their past. So this is something that can affect men as well as women. Another reason is because of bitterness. If they've allowed bitterness to come into their life for any reason, bitterness towards women, bitterness towards marriage problems, whatever it is, bitterness numbs the sensations, it turns the body off, and it makes the mate not as interested in the other mate. Now, another reason that a mate may not be satisfying their spouse is because of masturbation. Masturbation, there's several ways this can affect the marriage relationship. Masturbation can drain off a person's sexual energy so that they are not interested. They're not having this need to go to their mate to satisfy their needs. And also, masturbation teaches the person's body to respond in an artificial way so that they may not be getting the satisfaction out of a sexual act that God designed for them to get because they have mistrained their body to act in these ways. So this is a sin that definitely causes marriages to be desperate. It's something that's very frustrating to men. It's something that is very frustrating to women when this occurs with a husband. And this is a common problem. This problem is as common with men as it is with women. Okay, another sin we want to look at in desperate marriages is that of financial neglect. In Genesis 2:15, this is where God, before He had ever created Eve, God took Adam and He put him in the Garden of Eden and He told him to work. He told him to take care of the garden, to cultivate it, and to dress it. In 2 Thessalonians 3:10, this is where the people had stopped working because they thought Christ was coming back soon. And Paul says, if any will not work, neither shall he eat. In 1 Timothy 5, verse 8, this is where it talks about that if anyone will not work, he has denied the faith and he is worse than an infidel. So working is something that God has designed for man to do. And there are several kinds of financial neglect that go on in a marriage. One type of financial neglect is where the man just simply, he won't work. He's not interested in working. He expects his wife to go to work and to pay the bills. Or else he has an attitude of just working for a little while and then getting some money and then stopping and living off of that money and until he can till it runs out and then he gets another job. 1 Corinthians 6:10, this list of people that we saw that aren't going to inherit the kingdom of heaven, is the word covetous. The word covetous is throughout our New Testament. It's just in there a lot of times. Covetous means one eager to have more, especially what belongs to others. Greedy of gain, covetous. And this is something that many times men are very greedy in the way they control their money. They are very selfish and they are financially neglectful of their wives in the way they treat them this way. In Ephesians 5:28, verse 29, let's look at this right quick. Just this general passage of how a man is to treat his wife, how he is to be considerate of her needs just like he is considerate of his own needs. In Ephesians 5, verse 28 through 29, it says, so husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church. And so a man is to treat his wife financially like he treats himself. And I might add that this financial neglect is something that many times goes along with physical abuse. These men more or less make their wives be financial prisoners. They don't want her having any money so that she can leave them and get away from them. So this is something that does go along with that. I want to read you a couple of things here to give you some examples of financial neglect. Here is Ann Landers, a column to her. This lady says, I am 26 years old and have been married for 5 years. I have 2 wonderful children and a beautiful home. I quit my job when I had my first baby because it was too hard to work and care for the child. My husband, I'll call him Steve, makes a good living as a salesman. He travels during the week, and on weekends he sometimes stays out of town because he says it's cheaper than flying home Friday and out again on Monday. Also, he says he enjoys visiting with old friends. This weekend stuff has been happening 3 weekends out of 4, which means he is home only 2 or 3 days out of the month. Steve drinks scotch and smokes pot regularly. This runs about $100 a week. Last year he bought a bike for $300. Meanwhile, I buy my clothes at garage sales and second-hand shops. No matter how hard I try, I can't seem to make ends meet. Steve says he can buy anything he wants because he's the one who is busting his tail to earn a living while I'm sitting home on mine doing nothing. Last weekend, I went to my parents and told them I was considering divorce. They said I couldn't expect any help from them because they told me not to marry Steve and I wouldn't listen. I'm really confused. Can you give me some advice? So that's an example of financial neglect. I also have up here from one of the questionnaires that a lady sent to me when I had the questionnaires announced in Christian Woman. This is a lady down in the South, and she's talking about financial abuse. She says, I've also learned recently that our house, farm, truck, and car are all in my husband's name only. He says this is because I don't contribute to the financial responsibilities. He can't understand why I'm not sexually responsive, and he resents it. He wants me to work, and now that both our children will be in school this fall, I expressed a desire to return to college and complete my bachelor's degree. Then she says her husband sold stock and spent $6,000 on a 24 by 24 utility building workshop, and it was completed just yesterday. Is this sort of thing abuse? Should I shut up and be content? Does anyone have any answers?
And so this is a Christian woman who is dealing with financial abuse. And so this is something that is something that does go on. It's something that's very common, and it does cause a woman to be a desperate wife. Okay, I'm going to stop right there.